There are many different forms of human trafficking, and today on this video, I want to concentrate on the trafficking of children. I want to explain to you what it is, what to look for, and maybe some little hints on how you can protect your children. Trafficking of children is a form of human trafficking and is defined by the United Nations as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, and/or receipt, kidnapping of a child for the purpose of slavery, forced labor, and exploitation. The different forms of child trafficking include, but are not limited to, involuntary domestic servitude, forced child labor, illegal activities, child soldiers, and children exploited for commercial sex. Child trafficking is a crime and represents the tragic end of a childhood. Sometimes children are sold by a family member or an acquaintance. Sometimes they're lured by false promises of education and a better life. The reality is that these trafficked and exploited children are held in slave-like conditions without enough food, shelter, or clothing, and are often severely abused and cut off from all contact with their families. Children are often trafficked for commercial sexual exploitation or for labor such as domestic servitude, agricultural work, factory work, and mining, or they're forced to fight in conflicts. The most vulnerable children, such as refugees and migrants, are often preyed upon in their hopes for an education, a better job, or a better life in a new country. Every country in the world is affected by human trafficking, and as a result, children are forced to drop out of school, risk their lives, and are deprived of what every child deserves, a future. Tragically, both girls and boys are vulnerable to being trafficked. However, girls are disproportionately targeted and must deal with lifelong effects of gender inequality and gender-based violence. Girls are 2 times as likely to be reported as trafficking victims as boys. Girls tend to be trafficked for forced marriages and sexual slavery. Boys are typically exploited for forced labor or as soldiers. About 120 million girls worldwide, slightly more than 1 in 10, have experienced forced sex or other forced sexual acts at some point in their lives. Often girls around the world are forced to drop out of school or denied access to income-generating opportunities. This resulting social exclusion can trap girls in a cycle of extreme poverty, as well as increase vulnerability to trafficking and exploitation. Because child trafficking is often linked with lucrative criminal activity and corruption, it's hard to estimate how many children suffer, but trafficking and exploitation is an increasing risk as more children around the world live in conflict. Children are targeted for trafficking in the U.S. and are trafficked into the country from around the world. Often children are trafficked from developing to developed countries. Victims are trafficked under various circumstances, including prostitution, online sexual exploitation, the illegal drug trade, and forced labor. In the U.S., 60% of child sex trafficking victims have a history in the child welfare system. Foster children in particular are vulnerable to being victimized by child trafficking. Traffickers often groom children, families, and communities to gain their trust. They may also threaten families with violence or threats. Traffickers often promise children and families that they'll have a better future elsewhere. Trafficking is also an economic crime. Traffickers may ask families for money for providing documents or transport, and they'll make a profit from money a child earns through exploitation, forced labor, or crime. They'll often be told this money is to pay off a debt they or their family owe to the traffickers. Traffickers may work alone or in small groups, recruiting a small number of children, often from areas they know and live in. They may be medium-sized groups who recruit, move, and exploit children and young people on a small scale. They can also be large criminal networks that operate internationally with high-level corruption, money laundering, and large numbers of victims. Knowing the signs of trafficking can help give a voice to the children. Sometimes children won't understand that what's happening to them is wrong, or they might be scared to speak out. It may not be obvious that a child has been trafficked, but you might notice unusual or unexpected things. They might spend a lot of time doing household chores, or maybe they rarely leave their house or have no time for playing. They may be orphaned or living apart from their family. They may be unsure which country, city, or town they're in. Maybe they can't or are reluctant to share personal information or where they live. They may not be registered with a school or a GP practice. They may have no access to their parents or guardians. They may be seen in inappropriate places like brothels or factories. They may have money or things you wouldn't expect them to. They may have injuries from workplace accidents. They also may give a prepared story which is very similar to stories given by other children. Trafficking can have both short and long-term effects, and the impact can last a lifetime. Children and young people who've been trafficked might not understand what's happened to them as abuse, especially if they've been groomed. They may believe they're in a relationship with their abuser and unaware they're being exploited. They may think they played a part in their abuse or have broken the law. They may feel guilty or ashamed about the abuse they've suffered. Being kept captive or living in or working in poor conditions can have a serious impact on a child's mental and physical health. They might also be suffering from the effects of abuse and neglect. Children may feel distressed and alienated if they've been separated from their families, friends, communities, and cultures. They'll often have no access to education or opportunity for social and emotional development. Children exploited for domestic servitude and forced labor can suffer physical injuries, develop problems with their emotional health, and be denied access to an education. Children trafficked for sexual exploitation are at high risk of prolonged periods of sexual violence, physical injuries, sexually transmitted infections, and for girls, multiple pregnancies. Children and young people who've been trafficked might find it difficult to talk about their experiences or to tell anyone what's happened to them. Children are often too scared to speak out. They might be frightened of what'll happen to themselves, their friends, and their family. All adults and authorities, being prosecuted for a crime, being returned to their home country where their situation may even be worse. Juju or witchcraft rituals performed during their experiences, or judgment from their community and families. They may also feel very guilty or ashamed about the abuse they've suffered.